It's my pleasure to bring on with us today Craig Shirley. Before getting into his professional bona fides, I have to say, I've known Craig since 1980, since we both cut our teeth in politics at the National Conservative Political Action Committee. Craig went on to form a public relations company that is one of the top PR companies in Washington, D.C., working for nothing but conservative clients. But Craig also became, at some point in his life, decided to become an historian. And in no time at all, among other things, became the most prominent historian about Ronald Reagan, I think alive today. And none of us saw that coming in you. He has written 5 books on Ronald Reagan, The Reagan Revolution, Rendezvous with Destiny, my favorite, which is Last Act, which is the final days of Ronald Reagan, which is the most powerful. And I'm going to ask you a question about that in a minute. What was it, Reagan Rising?
Reagan Rising.
And then Citizen Newt, about Newt Gingrich, which also deals with Ronald Reagan.
And I'm working on 3 more Reagan books now.
3 more Reagan books. There's that much to be said about Ronald Reagan. Matter of fact, how many books have been written about Ronald Reagan?
Oh, well over 1,000.
Over 1,000 books.
Most of them are pretty lousy, though.
Really? Well, you know, conservatives, I think, need to relearn about Ronald Reagan. An entire generation. I spoke at American University not too long ago, and I was talking about Reagan, and I just saw these blank looks on everybody's face, and I realized, a show of hands, who was born during Ronald Reagan? Not one hand went up.
No.
We don't realize that. Then when you talk about the Berlin Wall, you talk about the Reagan Revolution, and so much of it is determined by what the media write.
Yes.
You know, you've seen it with Wikipedia and their interpretation of what Ronald Reagan was. So you understand this. But then you come out with another book, which for those of us who know you, was utterly unexpected. A biography on Mary Ball Washington, George Washington's mother. Why'd you write that? And I'm going to tell you, as soon as you answer, I'm going to tell you why you wrote it. But go ahead.
Well, why don't you just answer? I'll listen to you answer.
No, you go first, then I'll correct you.
You want my snarky answer or my real serious answer?
Both, and then I'm going to correct you.
Okay. George Washington and Ronald Reagan are the 2 presidents I admire the most. There are a lot of presidents I admire. I admire most of the presidents for one reason or another, but you have to be something special to reach that position of authority. There has to be something unique in your character, unique in your drive, unique in your ability. In this country of millions and millions of men and women since 1787, only 44 men have achieved that high honor. So what is it? What is a unique characteristic that all these men have? But I want to do a book on Washington, Brent, but the scholarship, of course, now I'm going to correct myself because the scholarship seemed fairly exhausted. And then, of course, a whole plethora of new Washington books has recently come out, so puts the lie to my statement. But I did realize, Zarina and I, we go to Whitechapel Episcopal Church down on the Northern Neck. Mm-hmm. And it is the ancient church of the ancestral Ball family. This is where Mary Ball went to church. This is where her family went to church. Her mother, her stepfather, is that. And so, we started looking into it. And I always knew that history was kind of rough on Mary. And I thought, like everybody else, well, she was a helicopter mother, and she was mommy dearest, and this and that and the other thing. And then we started looking into it. And I started going through the research and going through. She has a museum named after her down in Lancaster, Virginia. And then there's her home in Fredericksburg, and then there's the Kenmore Inn in Fredericksburg, and there's other sources. There's not any one repository. Like you can go to the Reagan Library and learn almost everything you want to learn about Ronald Reagan, but there's no one repository. And so after going through letters at Mount Vernon and the Society of Cincinnatus and other things, a picture began to emerge that this was a much more complicated woman. She was much more compassionate. She was much more interesting than the shorthand explanation by history. Even Ron Chernow, who wrote several years ago his masterpiece Washington, he got Mary wrong. He said in his book, he said she was an unlettered countrywoman. Well, as a matter of fact, for someone who was homeschooled, women didn't go to public school or even private school or tutors in 1720s, 1730s. She was an articulate woman in her letters, and she wasn't a country bumpkin. She was a sophisticated woman who grew up on a farm, who owned a farm, managed slaves, managed farms, but Fredericksburg in the 1730s, 40s, 50s, 60s was a major center of commerce. And so she was not unlettered, and she was not a country bumpkin. She was a lettered woman who was sophisticated for her time. So anyway, and I realized is that history had been very unkind to Mary. And there'd been hagiographies, slim little books like Parson Weems in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and then that was kind of the June Cleaver, era of her scholarship. And then after the Civil War, when the reality era took hold in American literature, and you got harsh looks at mankind like Melville and Crane and Stephen Crane and others, and then this harsh Joan Crawford image emerged of Mary Ball Washington. But neither was correct, and both were correct, and I wanted to sort it all out and get it correct.
Again, your snarky answer as to why you wrote the book?
I didn't have anything else to do.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to give the reason now. That was a good answer, but that's not the real answer. Here's the real answer.
I'm waiting to be enlightened.
No, you're going to be. No, you're not. Because you know the answer. In the book, I mean, it's a fascinating book in the way you set it up about what Virginia was looking like, and how it was maybe it and Massachusetts were the center of the universe.
Absolutely.
In America. But you write about how in 1783, the number of Virginia's counties tripled as population shifted and frontiers opened. You talk about Spotsylvania County, which was established in 1721, and it was a special place of interest for Washington. You talk about the largest city, Fredericksburg. You talk about port towns like Alexandria. You talk about how John Carter built the first church in the region. His son, Robert Carter, born 1662 on Carrottoman Plantation in Lancaster County, acquired land enough and wealth appropriate for his nickname, King Carter. But then you write, one of the most prominent houses in Essex County was Ben Lomond, a Georgian manor a short riding distance from the town of Tappahannock, with land stretching out to the Rappahannock River. It saw frequent renovations through the years as prominent Essex family members settled in, including its most famous occupant, Judge Musco Garnet. It was named after a mountain in the Scottish Highlands. Why did you bring up Ben Lomond?
Well, because I own it.
All right, now. So,
yes, I wrote the whole book just so I could write.
I'm going to answer the question I asked because I know you, and you're a scholar. Now, deny this if you'd like. You bought Ben Lomond. You live in Ben Lomond. You are a student of history. Did you look around your surroundings with the interest of a scholar, wondering what was happening?
Yes.
And I'll submit that that's what got you to write the book.
Well, that's probably a better answer than mine. Is that Zuri and I have been in Washington for 35 years, and we finally decided, the children we were empty nesters. The children were out, and we'd always wanted to own an historic home, and we love Virginia, despite its recent direction toward mindlessness in Richmond. But we love Virginia countryside and the people and all that. And so we looked for 7 years for an historic home. We looked all over the Commonwealth. And our long-suffering agent, we looked specifically for antebellum or even older. And our long-suffering real estate agent, who drove to Boston, Virginia, and drove to Harrisburg, Virginia, and drove to West Point with us, she finally, because we were looking for a rundown house to fix up, and she says, why don't we look at an antique house that's already been fixed up? Because you know what? It's going to cost you the same amount of money, and it'll save you a lot of stomach lining if you just, and so we looked at this house, And we fell in love with it as soon as we went up the driveway. And the owners, he and his wife were lovely, lovely people. They're very, very wealthy. He was the founder of People's Clothing Stores, had made tons of money in franchising and all this, and they owned 5 other houses. And they had rehabbed Ben Lomond, which was built in 1730. It's a 4-square Georgian manor house. But they rehabbed it, and then they never went there. And she didn't like it there. She thought it was too remote, and we fell in love with it, and we settled within a week. You know, they had it listed for X price. It'd been on the market for several years. You know, something like only 2% of the buying public wants antique homes. 98% want new. They want with warranties. They want new kitchens and new bathrooms and new fixtures and all that. They don't want to deal with the headache of dealing with an antique home. So that makes us very peculiar, I guess. We settled. You know, it was been listed, but they were soft. And I said to the agent, what do we do? She said, make a ridiculous offer. I said, how ridiculous? And she said, not so ridiculous that you can't look at yourself in the mirror in the morning. So we made a ridiculous offer, and they countered immediately with a 3/4 ridiculous offer, and we settled. Mm-hmm. And you know, as I tell people, is that I got out of Washington with my sanity, my sobriety, and my integrity.
Wow. Talking about the 2%. So Mary Ball Washington, I don't think a lot of people knew that she was that she was a single mother.
Yeah. Quintessential single mother.
Yeah. Well, you know, in today's day and age, sadly, that's not surprising. That's an everyday occurrence. But back then,
yes.
How was she seen? What were the circumstances, and how was she seen in the community as a single mother?
Well, she'd married Augustine when she was 19 years old, her husband, and they were married for something like 11 years, and she quickly had 6 children, bam, 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 George being the oldest, and then Mildred being the youngest, and then Mildred died in infancy, about 2.5 years old, I believe, and then Augustine passed away when George was 11 years old, and so Mary was the quintessential single mother raising 6 children on her own in a century that wasn't very hospitable to women. And so how does this, I mean, so this remarkable woman holds it all together, holds the family together, teaches her children, supervises Ferry Farm, which she was the caretaker of until it passed to George when he reached the age of majority, and instill and create arguably the greatest man in the history of the world by the lights of King George III after the Revolutionary War. How does she do it?
Yeah,
I mean, his father died when he was 11 years old, and he had a half-brother. Augustine had been married before to Jane, and then Jane passed away, and she left 3 children, and the oldest was Lawrence, who George adored, but Lawrence was much older, was in the British Army, was traveling a lot. So he wasn't there in Fredericksburg very often. So, and his father dies when he was 11 years old. So where did he get all those great qualities that we ascribe to George Washington that have become the model for every president thereafter? That his integrity, his bravery, his faith, his honor, his courage. Where did he get all that? He had to get it from his mother.
And, you know, the founder of the country,
Yes.
Arguably the single most important man in American history.
When Hamilton and Jay and Madison were writing the Federalist Papers, making the argument for a constitution to replace the failing Articles of Confederation, and when they described the chief executive in the Federalist Papers, they had George Washington in mind. He was unanimously chosen to lead the Continental Army, unanimously chosen to preside over the Constitutional Convention, unanimously picked as President of the United States, and then unanimously reelected.
Right.
He was the essential man, and everybody in America understood that. When he was chosen, John Hancock thought he was going to be chosen to lead the Continental Army, but everybody said, no, Washington has the experience. We need a Virginian because Virginia is kind of the heart. Virginia and Boston, you're absolutely right. Virginia and Boston were the hearts of the Revolution, along with Philadelphia, but Philadelphia was more the academic side as opposed to the actual revolt side. But they needed a Virginian, they thought, or somebody from Massachusetts to kind of bring everything together. And so Washington, they arrived at very quickly, was the natural and only choice.
Where were Mary Ball? I think we should need to show the book. I haven't showed it yet. So, I mean, this is, you'll find in bookstores,
Yes.
on Amazon.
Barnes & Noble.
Buy several. Buy one for yourself. Buy one for your mother. Buy one for your school and tell them to teach it. Maybe somebody will learn something in a school somewhere. Where were Mary Ball Washington's loyalties during the war?
That's a great question.
That's why I asked it.
And I have to set this up. Is that Mary was born we don't know when Mary was born, but she was born in the early 1700s, probably about 1707, 1708, somewhere around there. But there was never a record in a family Bible, and certainly wasn't, you didn't do a birth certificate at the local hospital or with the county or anything like that then. She was born at home. She was born in a British culture. The American colonies were, for all intents and purposes, British. Mm-hmm. British fashion, British cuisine, British laws. The Anglican Church was the Church of England. It was the governing organization which presided over the colonies. Is that taxes, laws, morals, everything emanated from the Church of England, the Anglican Church.
King Carter was directly from the crown.
Yes, exactly. So this Virginia and America was British, British money, everything. And so she grew up marinated in a British, nobody ever thought, well, Americans are different. That didn't happen until 1750s, 1760s, 1770s, with the Intolerant Acts, the Townshend Acts, the Stamp Act. More and more the King George III and the Parliament are levying taxes and regulations on the American subjects. Our subjects in the colonies is how they referred to us. And then kind of the push came to shove with the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian Wars. And then the regulations and taxes really came down on the American colonies, and that's what really were those the seeds for the American Revolution. But up until that time, nobody thought, we have the British Army and Navy to protect us, we have British laws to protect us, we have the British Parliament to protect us. We didn't have representation in Parliament, and that peeved some people. But nobody actually thought about revolution until after the 7 Years' War, when Britain really started turning the screws on the American colonies.
But isn't it extraordinary? You talk about the British signature, the British DNA of Virginia. She was loyal. She had loyalist feelings to it because of her own family. Yet isn't it extraordinary that George Washington, who could have and was prospering from all of that, could have prospered even more so had he simply not done that little thing, which was to risk every single thing he had, including his life.
Our lives, our fortune, our sacred honor. Everybody who's in Philadelphia for the Declaration, and everybody understood is that, and some of the prescriptions of the revolutionaries were that they were to be caught, drawn, quartered, and their entrails burned. The British meant business. They really did. And so he risked
Sounds like
everything.
Something Bob Dole would do, but go ahead.
But so she's a British loyalist, and that there were, like, for instance, some French soldiers who went through Fredericksburg during the American Revolution, and some of them recorded that Mary was still a British loyalist, but she never took a public position. She never denounced her son. But here's what's interesting is during the 7 years of the American Revolution, now George was a prodigious letter writer. He wrote letters every place. Right. His 3,000 letters to Martha, she destroyed after he died. But he was a prodigious letter writer his whole life. But during those 7 years, when he was constantly writing his mother, during the 7 years of the American Revolution, he never wrote his mother once. But he also never made it. He also was a prodigious, made diary entries every day of his life, except during the 7 years of the American Revolution. He never records anything in his diary. And I'm convinced that he was afraid that some secret might fall into the hands of the British. Something he might betray about troop movements or their weakness or the strength or this and that. He just said, I'm not going to even try. I'm not even going to risk it. But it also, I think, too, maybe indicates that he knew his mother. I mean, he obviously knew his mother was not supportive of the revolution. And so why would he write her and maybe give away some sensitive information?
At the risk of alienating every supporter I've ever had, I'm going to praise Chris Matthews here.
I'm going to get up and leave now.
Some years ago, Chris was on the stage at Mount Vernon with Newt Gingrich, in two wingback chairs. Chris was interviewing Newt on the subject, what would George Washington think, or what would the founders think about politics today? It was brilliant. It was for an hour. They were excellent questions from Chris, even better answers from Newt. Yeah. The two of them are historians, right. And this was fertile ground for the two
Newt's
of them.
A better historian.
Yes, but on this one subject, it was an excellent interview. It gets me to thinking today, asking the same question. If Mary Ball Washington were alive today, what would she think of Hillary Clinton? How about that?
I'm trying to work in how I get a thrill up my leg into my answer. I mean,
if I'm taking it from the standpoint that in a very real way, Mary Ball Washington was
a feminist.
Yes, I was going to say that, and a trailblazer.
She was a
for her
liberated
time.
woman. Yeah, she was. But she had to be. It was a century that was not very hospitable to women. Women obviously didn't have the right to vote, but women in the 1700s couldn't own property technically. Is that their job was to take the property that their deceased husband left for their sons, didn't go to daughters, left for their sons, and then she was supposed to act in his oldest sons because of the whole the prodigy we inherited from England at the time. Is that she was supposed to be the caretaker of the property until George reached majority, and then she was supposed to hand it off to him. So women in the 1700s weren't even technically owned property. So is that she has to fight her way through. She's single. She never remarries, and that's an area too which history is kind of silent on because many women, especially women of property, remarried. Martha was. Her husband died, was wealthy, and then she married George, and she brought her wealth with it and really elevated his position in Virginia society. But I think that I don't want to be reckless here, but I think that she was probably a handful, and that men who may have thought she was eligible, maybe the children, and she's headstrong and tough, and all those attributes that we admire. Is that maybe some men in the 1700s didn't admire?
I was going to ask you, reversing the question, what do you think Hillary thinks of Mary Ball Washington? But that assumes that she knows something.
I think Mary Ball Washington would have thought more of Hillary than Hillary would have thought of Mary Ball Washington.
Good point. Very good point. Okay. Now you're going. Last question. We'll take it to question. Question I want to ask you. Then we'll take it to questions from our audience. You're giving a talk in Mount Vernon coming up soon. Yeah. What are you going to talk about? I mean, you're at the epicenter of the Washington legacy. Being there, being where his mother was. What's going to be?
I know.
What's going to be your message?
It hasn't sunk in, Brent, but it is a great honor. I've lectured at the Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park. I've lectured many times at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley. This is my first time at Mount Vernon, and this is ground zero for the American Republic. This is where the revolution began, because it began, at least in part, in the mind of George Washington. Right. And everything that we know today, everything we believe today, everything we embrace today, started with the mind and courage and integrity and character of George Washington. So it's going to be a little bit, I don't say overwhelming, but I want to savor the moment because I think because me being there is not important, but Marybelle Washington, George Washington, and Mount Vernon are important.
What is the date?
It's Tuesday it's a week after next Tuesday, so it's Tuesday the 23rd, I think.
Okay, so Tuesday the 23rd. If you're in the area, you should think about attending. I know I'm going to. If I'm in town, I don't know if I am, but if I am in town, I'm definitely going to go to it. Okay, let's open it up for questions.
Okay, so what surprised you the most in research and writing of this book?
How wrong history was about Marybelle Washington. How absolutely wrong. How everybody got her wrong. And as I said before, this was a much more complicated woman. She was a much more sophisticated woman. And she was a much more compassionate woman. And she, just in how she raised George and how she raised her other children. Now, clearly she invested most of her time and love in her firstborn. But, you know, the old saying, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world, is that she literally rocked the cradle and she changed George Washington's life to rule the world. Like, for instance, when he was 14 years old, he wanted to become he wanted to join the British Navy as a cabin boy. And she was dubious about this, so she wrote a letter to her stepbrother in London and asked his advice about George becoming a cabin boy in the British Navy.
Right.
And a hot letter came back within a very short period of time, you know, a couple months, whatever, you know, considering that mail didn't travel very quickly. Of course, probably traveled more quickly then than it does now, but even so, is that he said, under no circumstances can you let George become a cabin boy in the British Navy. He said there's a caste system. The sons of British royalty, then the sons of British subjects, and way down at the bottom, after Jamaican slaves, were Americans. Yeah. He literally said he will be treated like a dog. And this is at a time, too, the Admiralty kept excellent records of their crews and their compliments. And it was a time when 1/3 of British cabin boys died at sea, right. Washed overboard, killed in battle, scurvy, dysentery. Plus, they were on these boats. You know, the crew were not model citizens. Right. They were, you know, the British Navy British Army used to go through the bars and brothels of London with what were called press gangs, and they would just grab men and, you know, maybe even get them drunk and then throw them on board the ship and, you know, maybe in chains or maybe drunk or passed out. And then all of a sudden they come to and they're 100 miles out at sea and they're a sailor. Right. Or a bosun's mate or whatever, but they're in the British Navy, and these are really rough, rotten guys.
Just thinking, could we come up with something for Washington, D.C. today where just grab people and throw them out into the ocean, but keep on going?
On a boat, maybe. That's a good idea. I like that. Well, of course, they had during the Revolutionary War, you know, they had those prison barges.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they were horrible affairs. They were terrible. You know, so something like 70% of all American prisoners died on these British prison barges.
Now I can't comment. About my suggestion. Well, let me.
So he ended up not joining the British Navy, and there, if he joins the British Navy, does he die at sea, or does he become a British sympathizer instead of the leader of the American Revolution? I mean, so right there, she altered history right there, and she did so many times in his life.
The difference between, so you're saying the difference between, you know, the noxious rewrite of history and this is that this is just ignorance of history. This is not. This is ignorance. I don't think it's done out of meanness. It's just ignorance. Whereas I combat every day meanness about Ronald Reagan. No. Or George Washington.
Or George. Well, yeah, but yes, about George Washington.
It's happening.
Yes, and we see that every day. There's a new book out by a woman she's very malicious in her treatment of George Washington, and half of the book is, well, let's just say her facts are somewhat stretched or specious. So you're constantly battling, but because because I've been writing books about Ronald Reagan for so many years, and it always comes to my attention. Like, for instance, CNN has a new documentary series called Race for the White House. And their treatment of history, and I participated because I wanted to make sure they got the history of Ronald Reagan right. Well, the documentary on the 80 campaign has already aired, and there were some gross errors in there, and they had a whole covey of liberal historians, and then me. And then last week they had whole covey of liberal historians talking about the election of 1812 between Taft, Wilson, and Roosevelt. And not in 1 hour do they ever mention, these liberal historians and the narrators never mentioned the overt racism of Woodrow Wilson.
Really?
Nothing. And this was a guy who wasn't passively racist. He was actively racist. Right. He's the one who issued, when he was president, the first executive order creating separate but equal in the federal government.
Right.
It had never been official law from 1865 until 1914. I mean, and the airs Birth of a Nation in the film in the white, and he loved it. He watched it over and over and over. And again, horribly racist movie.
Right.
And never once did any of these liberal historians ever mention that Woodrow Wilson was an overt racist.
Next question.
I'm going on the MRC cruise next year. Is Craig attending as a speaker?
Softball over the plate.
Yes,
over the plate.
Of course. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Serena, we loved it 2 years ago. We had a marvelous time. And I like debating Steve Moore on Trump versus Reagan because I beat the shit out of him. I'm sorry, Steve, you lost the debate. But
well, based on the reaction from the attendees, that was pretty accurate. That was pretty accurate.
Thank you.
No, Craig has been a lecturer, and we're really looking forward to him again. You're listening to him, and this is the man who's just got this this endless depth of knowledge. You do, because I've known you all these years, and you're curious. You're curious about our past, which not enough people are.
Socrates once said, "The beginning of wisdom is the acknowledgement of how little you know." That I am curious.
But you have uncovered. I got to get to this one question that had nothing to do with this book, but about another book, the book that you did, Last Act.
Yes.
I think you were the one who uncovered it, or at least you brought it to the public's attention. What was the anecdote about what Ronald Reagan did different after he was shot that nobody knew? How he dressed, what he carried.
Oh, yes. Yeah, well, he had actually, he started carrying a .38 with him. He had it in his briefcase, and he carried that for the rest of his days in the White House.
So he's got the nuclear. He's got the
nuclear coat, and he's got a .38 revolver.
Just in case nukes didn't work.
Just in case, yeah. And the Secret Service was not very happy about it. Hey, he said, fellas, I'm the President of the United States, and I'm going to carry this. I'm going to arm myself. I'm going to defend myself. I'm going to protect myself. I'm not sure that he ever would have had the time again to reach into his briefcase and pull out. But for him, psychologically, it's important.
Wasn't it quintessential Ronald Reagan?
Absolutely.
That he
take matters into his own hands.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Quintessential Reagan. He was never the passive instrument of anybody that people have falsely portrayed him to be. He was always a man of action, a man who always controlled his own destiny.
Which is why people really do need to, and I'm very serious about this, people need to read these books that you've written about Ronald Reagan. I mean, this guy, it reminds me of books on Robert E. Lee. That one historian, forget his name, started a book by saying, this is not going to be like every other book that heaps praise on Robert E. Lee. This is going to be an historical accounting of the man. And for the next 250 pages, he heaped praise on Robert E. Lee. That is who Robert E. Lee was. And we all have our faults, but Ronald Reagan was bigger than life.
Yes.
And in this wretched rewrite of history that's taken place, an entire generation of Americans is being deliberately misled.
David McCullough said Brent, a couple of years ago, he said, we're now into our third generation of historically illiterate Americans. Mm-hmm. And it's obviously part of liberalism, part of liberal control of public education. And it's not that it's hard to teach history. I don't think it's hard to teach history. It's just that they don't like that history. So they don't teach that history. And so consequently, you just experienced at American University where the students all gave you blank looks when you talked about Ronald Reagan. Now, is that historians will tell you is that most historians, Reagan was one of our 4 greatest presidents. Washington, Lincoln, FDR, and Reagan, because all these men freed or saved many, many people. And I think, I happen to agree with it, is that the truest standard to measure an American president is what he does to help people. And saving their lives or freeing them is the most important of all.
I remember Bill Buckley was once asked in a public forum to name the most important president, most consequential president in his lifetime. He said Ronald Reagan.
Of course.
And the audience erupted in laughter. The left just didn't want to appreciate that this is the man who, along with Maggie Thatcher and the Pope
John Paul II.
And with an assist to the AFL-CIO, brought down the Soviet Empire.
That's when the AFL-CIO used to be anti-communist.
Yeah.
The head of the ACIO, I remember in 76, 75, Ford had made a grain deal with the Soviets, and Lane Kirkland, who was the head of the AFL-CIO, ordered the Teamsters or the AFL-CIO members not to load grain onto ships going to the Soviet Union.
Again, how many people know that?
Yeah.
Nobody knows that.
Yeah.
And the labor movement should know this.
They ejected, like the warehouse workers union and the carpenters union were heavily infiltrated by communist members in the 40s and 50s, and they were ejected from the AFL-CIO.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, so looking ahead, where do you think, I see how once you have erased history, you can recreate history.
Which is what the left wants to do.
Which it is. Look at the New York Times with its 1619 program, which is...
Please don't get me started on that.
Well, I'm going to. It's noxious, but obnoxious, but it's also dangerous.
Yes, of course.
Explain in your words why it is dangerous. Why this rewrite of history, going back to the founding of the Republic, is so dangerous.
If we don't know where we've been, we don't know where we're going. If we don't have a fundamental understanding why this country was organized around the concept of freedom, why we don't understand why the average individual is more important than the state, more important than concentrations of power. That was the gift that the framers and founders gave us, was to reject the British monarchy, reject the British parliamentary system, reject the moneyed elites in London, and to say, look, is that you are a divinely inspired individual. And it is, in this country, this new republic, it is your right to pursue your dreams as far and as high as you want to pursue them. That is the basic that was the fundamental difference, is that in the British iteration, power flows down, British conservatism, power flows downward from the moneyed political elites down to the people. In the American iteration of conservatism, power flows upward from the citizenry to the, and that's what we need to remember, because then we become their slaves, is that the term public servant is for a reason. Mm-hmm. Chuck Schumer works for us. Donald Trump works for us. All these public officials, all these elected officials work for us and not the other way around. And if we forget that, if we become ignorant of that, if they don't teach that anymore, then it stands to reason is that then we become wards of the state, we become slaves of the state, we become puppets of the state, which is happening in many ways now here in 2020.
You see the polls that show that 50% or whatever it is of young people think that socialism is okay, and people dismiss it and they say, well, they don't know what socialism is. I kind of reverse it. They don't know what freedom is. If they knew what freedom was, if they knew liberty, they would reject socialism. Right. But if you're not grounded in something, in liberty, how are you going to ever reject it?
To the extent that they engage in social media or they engage in the freedom to pursue whatever they want on the internet, or through their Facebook page, or through their Twitter accounts, is that they practice freedom, but it hasn't been articulated to them, and they certainly haven't intellectualized it. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like an amorphous thing. It's kind of like, it's there, but I don't understand it. I'll practice it. So I think that in itself is dangerous.
Craig Shirley. Every father has a mother. I guess every founding father has a founding mother, and I
Yes.
guess every the first man in America, the first president, had a first mother.
Yes.
And I want to thank you for writing this book, Mary Ball Washington. Highly recommended. People should read it. You should read it. Have an appreciation for the founding of the Republic, and have an appreciation for the mother who raised the father, who became the father, or raised the son who became the father of our nation.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you
Craig.
very, very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.